So our first speaker, Roger Walker, will discuss some of the reasons why you should consider upgrading your building. Roger has been extremely active in this space, both from a technical as well as a regulatory perspective. He's the Director of Walker Eco Strategies and has been pivotal in the development and growth of the environment strategy for some of Australia's leading organisations, including the Sydney Opera House, Local Government Super Portfolio and Singtel Optus. So welcome, Roger.
Thanks very much, Matt. So I've got 15 minutes to explain to you why you should upgrade your building. We will cover a fair bit in that short time. So what are we covering? We'll go through an overview and look at the economic imperatives when you're thinking about where your building is and the future of your building from a financial side. A couple of areas of that, the rising resource costs, and then the main impact though from a decision on upgrades, evaluation impact. We'll look in some stats on the Building Better Returns research report. And then we'll look at what's driving those differences in valuation for the green buildings with legislation, investor expectation, the tenant expectation. And then also look at briefly on environmental upgrade agreements, improving returns, and sort of what are the tenant drivers for that, but for upgrades generally. So I think everyone's pretty aware resource costs are going up, particularly around electricity. So this year in New South Wales we've got a 20% increase, about 10% from network and 10% from the carbon pricing. The ABC the other day, they just had a report and said that New South Wales electricity in the last 5 years have gone up 80% and 30% across nationally. So we've sort of been hit pretty hard and it's going to happen further. In relation to costs for base building of commercial property, your best performing buildings, so if you look at a 5.5-star building in Sussex Street, an example of later, it's about $12.40 a square metre for the base building electricity, so that's about the best that you're going to get, depending on your electricity contract. So for an average performing building, you're probably looking at about $40 a square metre. So that, in comparison to your gross rents, is a factor, and it is increasing. In relation to water, it's still relatively inexpensive, so all the concentration from a financial aspect is on energy reduction. Looking at the valuation impact that you have on your building in relation to its energy performance and environmental performance, there was research that was conducted between 2010 and 2011. It was commissioned by the Australian Property Institute and Property Funds Association of Australia, and it was conducted by University of Western Sydney and the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands. The coverage of this is the first detailed study that was completed in Australia, and it had good industry collaboration with a lot of detail on a lot of the markets in Canberra, Sydney and Sydney suburban. So it covered 59% of the Sydney CBD market, 45% suburban, which included Parramatta, North Sydney, St Leonards, Chatswood, Rhodes, Homebush Bay, Macquarie Park and South Sydney, and 43% of the Canberra market. Within that, 56% had sort of the energy and environmental ratings, and about 44% didn't have ratings in there. So I was looking at extracting those green premiums and being able to factor into the differences in those buildings in size, quality and location. It included the detailed review on incentives as well as existing rents. But what we found there was that there was a significant premium in the higher end of the ratings, particularly on the neighbours' energy, and within that, it's the valuation component that obviously is going to impact that decision. It's about a 9% average across those markets. But individually in those markets, the differences between the Canberra, suburban and the Sydney markets were significant. CBD values in Sydney showed an increase at the higher level and a discount of about 10% down at the lower range of your neighbours' energy ratings. It's similar with the rents. Sydney suburban didn't see that discount down at the lower rents. If you go into Canberra, the Canberra values showed a very significant premium at the higher end and a very significant decrease at the lower end. So looking at those government policies within those different areas and the market forces, so my interpretation of this is that obviously the federal government very strongly long-term around the green leases and the push for buildings. Also the newer stock that's in Canberra, pushing those rentals up a little bit as well. And then within the Parramatta, within the Sydney CBD, there's a lot of the corporate pressure around I've got to be in the high-rated buildings. I think that's probably the primary driver. I don't think we've seen a lot of action and a lot of influence from the New South Wales State Property Authority in this area. I think that's reflective when we look at the Parramatta, the Sydney suburban areas where you don't see that differential discount down in the lower. But the question is what's going to be happening in the future when you're looking at upgrading your building. Also, we reviewed the Green Star component, which was similar to the review that happened overseas in the US with about 12% premium in Green Star buildings. So the issues that come out of this, is the first detailed evidence. And what we're seeing sometimes is a risk approach across your building. It's about sometimes why you upgrade is to avoid the loss in the value as much as trying to take advantage of securing improved value in the building. Quickly look at the legislation that's impacted. So those values are what's impacting that in the market. So there was a building code that came in 2006, the Section J, and that gets strengthened as we move forward. It angers reporting and the energy efficiency opportunities. Some funding for the New South Wales Energy Savings Scheme on the incentives. So a lot of the grants now aren't available for commercial property that were around for a while, which was good. But the one thing that is overlooked by a lot of people is the New South Wales Energy Savings Scheme. So we can have a significant impact. And Sonic Centres was a really good example. They did a lighting upgrade through there, and 37% of their costs they received back from the energy saving certificates. Commercial building disclosure is having an impact in the market, and that's also got a lighting assessment in that, which is having an impact in upgrading the tenancy areas for commercial buildings. And then we have environmental upgrade agreements coming in place as an option and an ability to actually maximise your return. And then we've also got the carbon price which comes in, which to me is more about awareness rather than a huge cost increase, and it really is creating that awareness that people are thinking about, well, I better do something, I better do it. And I think the carbon tax, in the property industry, the carbon tax was actually quite good. If it didn't have a carbon price that was looking across the market in all areas, then the next lot of legislation which might impact the commercial property might be what they proposed in New York City. This was actually watered down quite a lot and sort of turned back into like energy efficiency's opportunity, but they had legislation where they were looking at all the buildings over 10,000 square feet, so about 3,000 square metres, having to upgrade to the current BCA standards for all aspects of energy efficiency, or their equivalent standards, over the next 10 years. And if you upgraded next year, then you were ticked off for the next 10 years, that met your standard. If you didn't upgrade for 8 years, you had to meet the standard in 8 years. So it was, well, we have to upgrade these buildings, they have to move, so in 10 years all of their stock would meet that requirement. So they got watered down, a whole lot of pressure and stuff. But it's more an example about sort of what's going to happen in the future, what are we going to have to do, what is the legislation going to be. So it's about preparing yourself for the future. Well, when you're upgrading your building, it's not just what's happening right at the moment. And I think there will be action across in New South Wales once State Property Authority apply a bit more influence. The other component of why I upgrade your buildings is the investor side. So from an investor side, when I'm looking to buy the building, you've got to think about who am I going to sell my building to. So who are you going to sell it, and what's their influence, and what's the impact? What are they going to expect, and how are they going to either discount the price that they're going to be giving me, or how are they going to be comfortable about purchasing my building? A lot of larger investors will do due diligence on the cost to actually upgrade the building to meet a 5-star standard. And it becomes standard process within their procedures, and that's the bit they get. If you're not meeting that standard, they do two things. They do, well, that's the cost that's going to cost me to it, so we'll discount for that. But they also have a component where they see that as a risk. So they're looking at what's the cap rate that I'm paying for that building? Well, I'm not going to pay as good a cap rate if I see that as a risk in the building, so specifically with the market that it's in as well. But they'll look at that and then factor that in. And that's actually the component where the valuations will then reflect, just reflect the sales. But it is an area that does impact, and it is a serious consideration when you're looking at the sale for your building. The other part is it takes you a couple of years to get a rating, so if you want to do something and sell it in a couple of years, you need to be starting now. From a tenant side, sort of how are they impacting in the valuation side of it? Well, that's obviously the rent that comes in, and what do they consider? And their expectations getting stronger and stronger. And as the market moves up, the competitiveness around some of these tenants becomes stronger and stronger as well. They're sort of chasing each other. So the drivers for them, like government need to meet their emission targets. They've got very strong policies. They've got to be in buildings that are going to enable them to, or assist them to do that. When you've got tenants, when you're looking from a corporate social responsibility and their reporting that they do, they have to make sure that the buildings that they're in are efficient and meet their CSR standards. They need to report back to their investors, they need to report to their clients, and they need to report, very importantly, back to their employees. And the employee expectation for what buildings they're occupying. In relation to the cost management, sort of how a tenant views that, it's, well, you know, I might be a $20 a square metre difference between being in your building and being in this other building here. But if I'm negotiating on that, I'm going to say, well, you know, well, I want the $20 plus I'm a bit embarrassed to be in that building, so you're going to have to discount more. So keep pushing the money out until you put enough that makes me go into your building. So it's not simply that cost differential that a tenant will look at, it's the impact on their operations, on what they do, and their feedback back into their corporate businesses, what they can get signed off. I'm going to put something up to the CEO or back up to the head of property or whoever the sign off is. Yeah, great, we're going into a 2-star building, I've got a really good rent. It's like, wait a second, what are you doing? Costs of a business are predominantly staff and employees. They're not property costs. The impact that you have is on the other cost components, not directly on the property cost. Tenants are becoming more aware of this as the community becomes more aware. When you look at the components and you look at the environmental upgrade agreements, and to move on to an example of this, there's an opportunity with it. The environmental upgrade agreements, as an owner, you can utilise that to try to develop the relationship better with your tenant. But it's about meeting their targets and their components within their own internal reporting and their ability to actually provide positive news back into to their business. The tenants will get the benefits back in from the upgrade, and then it's really, they're not in a financially worse off position, and they'll hopefully, with the right approach that you take to them, be happy to share those financial savings that come from it. So I just want to quickly run through just an example for an environmental upgrade agreement. So there haven't been any environmental upgrade agreements in New South Wales. So we've taken a project that's been completed and said, okay, if you did an environmental upgrade agreement, then how would this work? And then what are the drivers for people behind that? So 120 Sussex Street, Carnegie Morgan Hill House, owned by local government super, 1991 construction, won the Property Council of Australia's existing buildings Sustainable Development Award in 2012. It's the first 5.5-star building in Sydney and the most energy efficient. So that was about $1 million worth of works. They upgraded, you know, your standard sort of stuff that everyone does, put in an outdoor air system. They had an estimate, this is when the EUA works out, that 45% of the energy reduction, and from that would do a $7.50 per square metre reduction in the power costs. They saved a bit more. And within those works, an interesting component they did there, they did two parts of evaluation after the fact. So they received an $800,000 improvement in the value of the property immediately following the works. They got a green building fund, so $500,000 cost with $800,000 improvement. And then they have improved tenant relationships with the building because you're in the most efficient one in Sydney. But when we look at the impact for EUA, how an EUA would affect that, we're going to look at that building and then also say, well, if that building did a tenancy lighting upgrade through the whole building, they'd already done part, they did a few extra floors in the works, but separate to the base building works. So, assuming they had a standard TA 2x2.4x2.4 grid and moving to a single, the EUA charge and the savings, so they're going to save $7.50 a square metre. They saved a bit more, but under the legislation you use the basis of the savings, assuming the 80%, similar to the energy savings scheme rules, and if you did it on an energy performance contract, with the 80% of those savings is charged for the base building and their cost for the tenant lighting. Utility savings about $13 a square metre, and the EUA charge is $9.50. That's a 10 when I'm saving $4 a square metre. It's not something you get out of bed for, really. There's other things that you can concentrate on from a financial point of view. They did a pre and post productivity study in these works as well, and they had a 2% productivity increase back in for the tenants. So the first study that was done, I think 4 buildings, and it was pre the works and a full IEQ with a neighbours rating, productivity analysis estimate, and then post, they completed a post neighbours rating IEQ with productivity analysis, and that's what independently they came up with. From an owner's point of view, I'm getting, if I did 5 years, if it was a net lease, a few assumptions here, I'm going to get $318,000 worth of my energy savings from the tenant savings that have come back to me as an EUA charge, out of about a $1.2 million project, and on 26% of my cost. Splitting it up, you're about 20% of your base building costs you recover, and you recover about 50% of your tenant lighting. Tenant lighting is an interesting one because if I can then go and get, say, 25% from energy savings certificates, I've got a 75% to pay back if I get tax depreciation that I'm going to put in on the assets. And you know, I've got to meet BCA guideline, BCA standards at some time anyway. For an owner, it can become a profitable thing. from the tenant, it's also a profitable thing. So, but from a tenant, I mean, I'm not going to do anything for $4 a square metre, so why am I going to do it? So I think for the works and to meet the tenant components, to maximise that, where your building sits in the market and upgrading it, you need to make sure that you ensure that indoor environment quality is met with the works. And then those reporting that you're doing assist that tenant to meet their aims and their components of employee engagement, investor relations, and community expectation of what they can do.